Test.
Yep.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Christina Haggerty. I am the Vice President of Marketing, Communications, and Development for McHenry County College. Welcome to our first in a second series of our Experts and Insights speaker series featuring our wonderful MCC faculty. We do have some people in our Lucht Auditorium social distancing this evening, but we also welcome all of you who are joining us virtually, hopefully from the comfort of your cozy chair or couch at home. I'm really thrilled to kick this series off. Certainly, we would love to see more people in person, and we hope that one day soon within this series, since we will be running it through the end of next spring, we'll be able to do that and join together again. But in the meantime, I'm thrilled that we have the participation that we do both in person and online. So just before we get started, I want to just cover a couple housekeeping topics related to both this event and the series in general. First of all, we will be doing a question and answer with Sarah at the end of this session. And so if you are joining us online, virtually, we would ask that you use the chat bar throughout the session to enter your questions. And at the end of the talk, we will be sharing those out, and Sarah will have the opportunity to answer your questions at that time. And certainly those who are in person can ask live at the end of the session as well. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we have several other sessions with amazing topics that are coming up every month, with the exception of December, now through next May, June. And so we encourage you early as possible or at your convenience when you know your schedule to go online, check those sessions out and register, which all of these sessions for our community are free. It's very important for us to share with the community the amazing knowledge and expertise that our faculty have, so you get to experience what our students get to experience in the classroom on a regular basis. And so if you would like to both view the opportunities that are coming up over the next few months and or register for these free events, you can do that at www.mchenry.edu/experts, and it will take you to each of the registration links. Finally, I would like to give a thank you to our Friends of MCC Foundation, who are helping support this event and this series of events. Our foundation makes it possible in so many ways for programming as well as student scholarships to happen and give access to both our students and community to the wonderful resources that are part of McHenry County College. So just a few little things up front, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to answer those in the future. So now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to do a little intro about our guest speaker this evening, as well as introduce her to the stage. Sarah will be talking about the anti-suffrage women who fought against votes for women. Sarah Sullivan has taught history and business at MCC for 22 years, and she was our Faculty of the Year, being honored in the year 2016. She presents publicly on a variety of topics that focus on all people and things history, including Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, and women in the colonial and antebellum periods. She holds graduate degrees in both American history, management, and human resources, and loves nothing more than weaving history, stories, or two or more into every conversation. She is just a delight and full of knowledge. I've had the benefit of attending some of her sessions, including a recent session that maybe some of you participated in on Marshall Fields. I highly encourage, when you see her in the future giving a presentation, to sign up quickly. She is engaging and full of information and makes it fun to learn about history as well. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Sarah Sullivan.
Thank you, Christina.
someday we will not be using the mask, but for right now. So again, my name is Sarah Sullivan. I am here tonight to share with you the story of the anti-suffragist movement. So the anti-movement is a little tricky to track. It's always harder to get information about what didn't happen than it is to get information about what did happen. And you know, about a year ago when I thought about the fact that this 2020, well, what I thought about a year ago is that 2020 would be a celebration of the women's suffrage movement. I had no idea what else we would be celebrating in 2020. But at that point, I thought, you know, what about those women who were against women voting? So I thought that would be a terrific topic. I began doing some research and I discovered there was very little out there, which should have been a clue that there's very little out there. But I kept thinking, there's gotta be more, there's gotta be more. And really there isn't a lot about these women anywhere. And not very many scholars have taken any time to really research their thoughts or ideas. So let's find out what we have to discover tonight. I did want to give some research credit. Kudos to Brandon Cipolla. He is the MCC History Student of the Year 2020, and he helped research this project with me. He and I spent quite a bit of time this summer back and forth looking for information. So thank you to Brandon. I wanted to start today's presentation by talking a little bit about Catherine Beecher. Catherine Beecher is a woman who was born into a family of overachievers. Her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, you may have heard of. She had several famous brothers who were well-known preachers. Catherine Beecher was one of the famous authors in the 19th century. And one of the things that Catherine Beecher did is tell women how to live their lives. There are many books, if you're interested, on Google Books that will tell you things like how to cook a 10-course meal, how to bathe properly. The books will tell you how to feed your children, all sorts of things. So Catherine Beecher had some pretty strong opinions about women getting the right to vote. And as we read this quote, you'll see that she did not think it was a good idea. So what she said is, a large majority of American women would regard the gift of the ballot not as a privilege conferred, but as an act of oppression. Wow. Forcing them to assume responsibilities belonging to a man for which they are not and cannot be qualified, and consequently, withdrawing attention and interest from their distinctive and more important duties of their sex. So that just helps us frame a little bit what we're going to be hearing from a lot of different women who thought that this was a very bad idea indeed. The next picture I have for you is one that I love. In the top corner, you'll see everybody works but mother, she's a suffragette. And it's a man who looks not very happy about the fact that he's doing laundry. And I can understand that because men back then did not do laundry. You see him taking care of a baby and the cat and all of that while mom is out voting. And the quote at the bottom, "I want to vote, but my wife won't let me." That was one of the ways that the women's suffrage movement was framed, is that you would have women wearing the pants in the household and telling the man what to do, and that would be a complete disruption from social structures. So let's talk a little bit about suffrage. We can't talk about the anti-perspective until we really understand how the suffrage movement came to be. You can't look at the opposition until you look at what's going on in favor of an event happening. So in colonial history, there were two different women who actually sought the right to vote. So the idea of getting the right to vote was not a new thing in 1920 or even in 1820. The first woman that we know of in the colonies that became the United States who sought the right to vote was Margaret Brent. And she was the first female attorney in the colonies. She was a very well-connected woman who actually didn't marry. And the fact that she wasn't married actually gave her a little more authority, because in the colonial period and early 19th century, women who were married were under terms of coverture. And what that meant is the rights of the man cover the rights of the woman. So you actually had a little bit more power if you weren't married, and particularly if you were widowed. which worked out pretty well in the colonial era because there were women who ended up marrying 5, 6, 7 times. The death rate for men was pretty high. So Margaret Brent, in 1848, she asked for not only 1 vote, but she asked for 2 votes. The reason why she asked for 2 votes is she asked for 1 for herself as a landowner, because in this period, the criteria for voting was owning land. There wasn't actually any restriction on gender. It was based on land owning. And again, mostly men own land, so that really wasn't an issue. She also asked for a vote because she was the executor of a will. And she wanted to make sure that as the executor of this estate, that she had a vote for that reason. And the legislature in colonial Maryland met and they discussed it, and no surprise, she was not allowed to vote because she was a man. I would have put a picture up here, but we didn't have one since it was a very long time ago. But some paintings illustrate what might have happened in that period. Lydia Chapin Taft actually did get to vote in colonial America. So she is the first known female voter in the North American colonies. I say first known because we don't know what we don't know, and it's possible that someone else voted before her, but she is known as the first woman to vote in the colonies. Her story is a little different than Margaret Brandt's. She was widowed and her son died in 1756. If you're a history buff, you know what happened in 1756. So at that point, we're looking at the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, and Massachusetts was looking at sending troops into that war. So they needed to allocate funds and to approve the motion to send people into war. So they didn't have enough votes. And even though she was a woman, she was a property holder because she was a widow. And she didn't have any other men to vote for her. So the powers that be in the town that she lived in decided that it would be most appropriate for her to vote because she owned property. And so she cast her vote in favor of the war, which was what the people that wanted her to vote wanted to have happen. And obviously then Massachusetts contributed to the war. She was asked to vote twice more on tax and school issues. So again, we've got a woman voting in the colonial period without any concerns, but it's based on her ownership of property. So moving forward, New Jersey allowed women to vote all the way until 1807. So after the Revolution began, every one of the colonies, now becoming states, had to write a state constitution. And New Jersey's constitution was a little different from those of other states. They all worked off templates and ideas, but each state wanted to make their constitution their own. And the New Jersey Constitution said that suffrage was granted to all inhabitants of the colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds and have resided in the county for more than 12 months. So what does that mean? Well, if you own 50 pounds or more of property and you were of a certain age, you could vote, male or female. So did this mean that every woman was able to vote? Definitely not. The trick is, if you were married, as I mentioned earlier with property, if you were married, you were not eligible to own property. The property was owned by your husband. So even if you inherited a great estate from your father, for example, it wouldn't be yours. It would be your husband's estate, unless you weren't married or if you were widowed. So if you were one of those two things, widowed or single, and you own more than 50 pounds worth of property, you could vote. That was changed in 1807, in great part because there were some concerns about who got to vote. We see those even up till the current day. The issue of voting is really important in a society such as ours. And there were concerns by the powers that be in New Jersey at the time about immigrants and the poor being able to vote. It's probably important to take a step back at this point and remind you that the Constitution does not actually say anything about who gets to vote. And there are a lot of very exciting debates on C-SPAN if you ever want to check any of those out in the middle of the night if you're not able to sleep. But there are a lot of debates about why that is. Why didn't the federal Constitution address this issue? Why did they toss it to the states? We don't, there's a lot of theories, but either way, it was tossed to the states. So each state got to make their own decisions about who got to vote and who did not get to vote. That was only changed, that's only been changed a couple times with some federal amendments, or if there's federal legislation that overrides the state. So in this period, states got to decide for themselves who voted and who didn't. There are some who question that maybe the founders were in favor of political rights when they allowed women in New Jersey to vote until 1807. I understand those arguments. I'm not sure I agree because, of course, they stopped being able to vote in 1807, which doesn't say that the founders were necessarily in favor, and it was only one state. But again, women had the right to vote until this period. So we moved all the way up to 1848. That's the Seneca Falls Women's Conference. That is known as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. So it's important to realize the women's suffrage movement started in 1848 and officially ended with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So of all the people who attended that first convention in 1848, there was literally only one woman who was still alive by the time women got the right to vote. Every other person that was there at the beginning passed away before they finally got the right to vote. That is the longest social movement in the history of the United States. It was the longest effort to have that movement ratified. So the Seneca Falls Convention was a group of 68 women and 32 men. It's interesting to know that there were quite a few men who were involved in this women's rights convention. They signed what's known as a Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments is, it's modeled off the Declaration of Independence. And if you've read more than just the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, you know that the back half of it is a laundry list of complaints about the king. You know, the king didn't do this, and the king did that, and we're mad at the king for this reason and that reason. So in the Declaration of Sentiments, they did a very similar thing, except they are not necessarily blaming the king, but blaming men in general. You know, men aren't allowing us to do this, and they're not allowing us to do that. Of the resolutions that were put into the Declaration of Sentiments, there were 12 that were passed unanimously. Only one had any pushback. And funny enough, that is the one about women getting the right to vote. So even in this convention of people very much in favor of women getting the right to vote, we didn't see unanimous consent for women getting that right. So moving forward, the women's rights movement and the abolition movement ended up becoming very entwined. We see a couple of women's rights conventions happening later in the 1850s. So we've got one in Massachusetts, 1849. We've got another one in Akron, Ohio, in 1851. That is the event where Sojourner Truth gave her Ain't I a Woman speech, which many people know very well. In addition to that, what we saw in these conventions and in this period is, again, this intertwining between slavery and the abolition of slavery and a movement towards women getting the right to vote. And there was this idea that if we end slavery, we're actually going to improve conditions for everyone. So women were not necessarily working to end slavery to benefit themselves at the exclusion of eliminating slavery, but it was seen as a good, a common good for everyone. So this connection was very strongly taken. And of course, because women suffragists saw the end of slavery as an important step in their goals, all efforts on women getting the right to vote were basically put to the side during the Civil War. They do resurface right after the Civil War. So the first state to have a referendum on the issue of women's suffrage is Kansas. And we see that in 1867. So just a couple years after the Civil War is over, in 1865, women are back at it, or at least that's what many people thought. Women are right back at it, continuing to promote this idea of suffrage. So initially, the thought was they'll work state by state by state and get the right to vote that way, because that's how voting rights were managed, is by the states. So they weren't really looking at doing anything federally necessarily. It was more of a state thing. So we have Kansas. After that, there were another 480 campaigns initiated at the state level. Basically, every state legislative cycle, there would be another effort to try to earn the right to vote. Now you have to remember, back in this day, legislatures weren't in session the way they are now, and sometimes they would go a couple years where they wouldn't be in session, or there would be no reason for them to meet. But every time they did meet, there would be another push to try to get this issue on the agenda. Most northern states ended up voting on women getting the right to vote sometime after 1890. Before that, there was more of a struggle. Now, this is where we first start to see the antis show up. You know, we've talked about all these issues related to women's suffrage. We haven't talked about the people against, and that's what you came here for. So let's talk about those. So the local anti-groups, they were reactionary, and that's really important to note, that distinction. So the people promoting the idea of women having the right to vote, they were organized, they stayed organized, they continued to be organized. The anti-people would show up when it looked like there was some progress on the pro-suffrage movement. They would show up, they would try to squelch it, and then they would go back to their homes. So it's hard to really get our hands around who they were and what they did in some ways, because they weren't continually organized for this purpose. You know, it was almost like people showing up at a party and then they go back home. Well, who was it who showed up, and what were their intentions? It's a little hard to necessarily sort all that out. The women who were against found that it took them less than 6 months to really organize their opposition and put it all in place, in great part because the vast majority of people in the country agreed. Why do women need the right to vote? They all have men who will say for them. And when we get towards the end of the program, I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of the reasons why women didn't feel the need to vote. So Colorado was one of the first to enfranchise women in a popular election. There are a few states that had that right before, and we'll get to that in a minute. That was one of my challenges putting this together, is trying to keep the chronology and the information straight. There's a lot of moving pieces all at the same time. But Colorado is the first. And then we see Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. And what do all those states have in common? They were very much Western states. The Western states all saw women's suffrage well before the Eastern states, in great part because their numbers were smaller. So, and they didn't have the same level of opposition. They weren't as organized in structure. They were the frontier. So the opposition was not as strong. The American Equal Rights Association comes into being in 1866. So 1 year after the Civil War is over. We see supporters like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Henry Ward Beecher, and Sojourner Truth. So those are all names that many of you who study history or read anything about this period may have heard before. What they did in this movement is they again combined the idea of Black manhood suffrage with women getting the right to vote. So these are still being paired together. Now the dates at this point matter. So this is 1866, because we're going to see some changes which splinter the movement a little bit. In 1866, we also see a congressional amendment being proposed in the Senate for women to get the right to vote. This comes up when the senators are discussing suffrage in Washington, D.C. So they're looking at, you know, how do we administer suffrage in Washington, D.C.? And one of the senators says, well, what about giving women the right to vote across the board? That was almost unanimously squelched immediately. We're not doing that. So that was the end of that. But we see in December of 1868, hold on to that date because that's going to matter. December of 1868, we have a constitutional amendment being brought to the floor for the very first time in the Senate. And it says, the basis of suffrage in the United States shall be that of citizenship, and all native or naturalized citizens shall enjoy the same rights and privileges of the elective franchise. So basically what this amendment is saying is that everybody gets the right to vote. Doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter what gender you are, everybody's got the right to vote. It didn't go very far. So the other senators sat quietly and listened, and they agreed that they were not going to touch it, and it just basically sat on the floor for a couple days and just disappeared. So it was something that was not quite ready to happen yet. So again, December 1868. So moving forward, just a couple months later, February of 1869, we had the ratification of the 15th Amendment. This is where things start to become fraught for the women's suffrage movement, because now we see that race is no longer a limiting factor for getting the right to vote. What happened to gender? It didn't make it in. So as you can imagine, for these women who fought in the abolition movement, who fought for, they fought for the right to vote along with freed slaves, to discover that it wasn't going to happen for them was heartbreaking, was very frustrating. And today, just because in history you have to really be careful of your scope, it's very easy to go a little too broad and end up with a 12-hour program. And I want that, but I don't think any of you want that. If you do, talk to me, I'm happy to do it. But there were definitely some issues about some of the suffragists and things that they said that we would consider today to be horrible and racist. This is where some of it's coming from. What we see though, is we see a lot of frustration, and we see a split, a schism in the women's suffrage movement. There are two different groups now working for the same cause in different ways. So we have the National Women's Suffrage Association, and those are people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they are looking for a constitutional amendment. So they're going to focus on the national strategy. Let's get Washington, D.C. to pass this, and then we don't have to worry about nickel and diming every state separately. We also have the American Women's Suffrage Association, and that's Lucy Stone. And they decide, no, we need to go state by state by state. We're having some progress going state by state. Let's continue that strategy. By 1890, the two groups ended up merging. You'll notice that they were both organized in the late 1860s, and by 1890, they still hadn't made a ton of progress, so they ended up moving back together. But for a while, we see some separation and some strong debate about which strategy was going to get them where they wanted to go. So I ran into somebody years ago while I was on vacation who said they were from Wyoming, and they were really proud about telling me how Wyoming's the equality state. And I thought, okay, but here's why it's the equality state. And I'm hoping that this person knew why it was the equality state. So Wyoming was the very first in the world. It was a territory, not a state at this point, but it was the very first place in the world to give women the right to vote. And in addition to that, in 1870, we see the first woman appointed a justice of the peace. Also, we have the first equal suffrage vote cast in 1870. So Wyoming, again, the equality state, it's the first place where we start to see this happen. In the West, like I mentioned before, people were much more open to this idea. Other states, we have Kansas giving women the right to vote only in school suffrage. And that's put into their constitution by 1861. So this became an issue in this period. Do women get to vote on everything or just certain things? Maybe they should just vote on school stuff because, you know, they're the moms and they're taking care of their kids and they have an interest in that. Or maybe they should only vote on local politics because that affects them so much more so than national politics. So there were a lot of debates about which things women could vote on. And in many cases, like in Illinois, for example, women were not allowed to vote in some areas, but they were in others. You know, municipal, school board kind of elections, that made sense. There were some states that gave women the right to vote in the primary, but not in the general election. There were all sorts of parsing of the right to vote that happened throughout history. So we see Utah giving women the right to vote when it was still a territory in 1870, but it was taken back. So it was revoked by Congress in 1887. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it was part of a fear of the spread of the Mormon faith, that if we give all these women the right to vote, Mormonism is going to have more power than they should have. So let's take that right back. You can only imagine being a woman who's got the right to vote and then suddenly it's taken from you. That would have been very difficult. So now that we've got a framework, let's talk about the anti-suffragists. They really don't show up in force until 1871. So 1871, we see the Godey's Ladies book, and this would have been the book that all ladies would have subscribed to. It was the place where you found out what to wear and how to wear it. For a long time, it was actually hand-painted. All the fashion images were hand-painted. So that was a career that someone could have, is actually painting each magazine separately. Can you imagine? So the Godey's Lady book had a lot of power. And was very well known. So they were very much against women having the right to vote. Sarah Hale, who was the person who encouraged Abraham Lincoln to make Thanksgiving a federal holiday. She was also the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, so she had quite an interesting life. She was very much of an anti-suffragist, and she and the magazine pushed this idea of suffrage being bad. So they put a petition against suffrage in their magazine, in their May 1871 edition, and they encouraged women to copy this. And by the way, copy is not like we think now, where you just click a button. Like, copy it and then bring it to people in their communities and have them sign it as well. They ended up with 5,000 signatures that way that they submitted to Congress. In addition to that, they made a lot of arguments about why women's suffrage was not a good idea. They framed these arguments on things like the Holy Scripture, the idea that females are physically frail and not able to handle the burden of voting. They talked about the welfare of children. If children won't be cared for if their mothers are out voting and doing crazy things like that. They talked about marital stability. It's not good for a marriage if both parties are able to vote, and the social order in general. So those were some of the arguments that we see right off the bat in 1871. And why didn't we see a lot of pushback before 1871? Because there wasn't anything to push against. There weren't really a lot of places where women were voting. Most women who came to become the antis, they didn't really care about what was going on in the West. It was really when the movement started to come to the East and when it started to get a toehold that things started to change. So by 1895, we have the formal organization of a group that, I just love this name. I can't quite imagine how they managed to say it, but it was the Massachusetts Association Opposed to the Further Extension of the Suffrage to Women. So that's the acronym. I mean, in higher ed, we have a lot of acronyms, but not that long. So they were, again, organized in 1895 officially, but they were around before that. And that's the trick. These antis did not always organize formally. They were out there and they were working in kind of an ad hoc fashion for a little bit. They would squelch a movement and then they would go back to their homes. So by 1895, they sensed that there was enough of a movement towards women getting the right to vote that they needed to become organized. So they started to produce this journal called the Remonstrance. And Remonstrance is what they called themselves, that they were remonstrances. And that basically is to have an opinion, to kind of have a thought. So they managed to get petitions out there with over 200 signatures to try to stop referenda in Massachusetts in 1868 and 1869. By 1890, again, they were publishing this journal. And funny enough, the articles were anonymous under a male editor. So this was not necessarily a movement by women for women. Why were these articles anonymous? Well, one of the reasons why is because if you were a well-bred lady, you only had your name in the newspaper a couple times. Your birth, your marriage, and your death. So you certainly wouldn't want your name in the paper attached to any of this. That would have been part of it. And these were generally pretty well-known ladies who just didn't want that kind of publicity. They also didn't want the responsibility of having to edit and manage this, so they had a man do that for them. Also, if they were doing the kind of work that suffragists were doing, it would sort of defeat their argument about why getting the right to vote was not a good thing. So there were 26 state anti-suffrage associations. Up there I put how many states there were in 1900 because did anybody know? There were only 45 states. So almost half the states, not quite half, but well, actually more than half, ended up having an anti-suffrage association. Generally speaking, the ones in the East, New York, Massachusetts, They were the most organized. They were also essentially the most populous areas in the country, so that makes sense. Generally speaking, the women who were involved in these organizations were connected. They were middle-aged, so older than all of us, of course. They were involved in charity and civic reform, and they were people who were connected. They were daughters and wives of important men. They had a high social standing. I put a couple of the people that were high profile. In Illinois, it was Caroline Fairfield Corbin. Her husband was an influential wholesaler, and she was the president of the Illinois chapter for the entire 17 years that it was in existence. You may have heard of Alice Hayes Wadsworth or Mrs. J. Elliott Cabot, and notice they're all going by the Mrs. kind of name. So moving forward, by 1911, we start to see that the antis have to become more organized because the pro-suffrage movement is really starting to get some traction. So now we've got a national association opposed to women's suffrage, as opposed to just the state level. Now we've got one national organization. They publish a journal because that's what everybody did back then. Everybody published, just like we do web pages today. They published their own journal calling the Women's Protest. During World War II, they called it the Woman Patriot. Their masthead said, for home and national defense against women's suffrage, feminism, and socialism. So that was kind of their organizing principle. They had a membership of 600,000. Now the question is that 600,000 people who were involved in this committee, or is that people that were just on their mailing list? Are organized members, or again, just people who maybe asked for more information once or bought one edition of their journal? We don't really know. We sort of suspect that the 600,000 is an artificially high number, but again, in history, you only have the information you have. So during World War I, this group was very reactionary. What they would do is the suffragists would make an effort somewhere, and then the remonstrants would come along and try to stop it. So again, you have to remember, this is not a group that is doing anything on their own. They are trying to stop something from happening, which is a very interesting kind of way to run an organization, to focus it only on stopping someone else from taking action. By World War I, suffragists were really starting to make progress. You started to see them picketing at the White House and doing all these big efforts to try to promote suffrage, which really activated this anti-group. By 1917, New York has got the right to vote. So things became definitely very dire for this organization. They decided to focus, instead of focusing on states, they realized that they needed to focus more on the US government, because that's what the women's suffrage movement was doing. So they knew they needed to change tactics. And once the 19th Amendment was passed by the Congress, then they moved back to the states, because as you hopefully remember from high school, from junior year of high school, an amendment is passed by the Congress, and then it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that was their approach to try to stop this from happening. Now, this is the part that really, this is why I wanted to study this topic, is to get a better sense of what their arguments were, because to me, it doesn't make any sense. What's wrong with women getting the right to vote? We should be equal. And I just needed to wrap my head around it. So here's some of the information related to that. The first issue that they had was this idea of Republican motherhood. So in the Revolutionary period, many women thought they were going to get rights, because of course, what were we all fighting against England for? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that. Women thought that some of it was going to come their way. And they were very surprised, many of them, when it didn't happen. But what they were told they were getting out of this is that they were going to be Republican mothers, and their job was going to be to raise the next generation of patriots. Like, isn't that a good thing? Like, that's your prize. So because of that, you see in the social media of the day, books and sermons and magazines, everything promoting this idea that men and women are different, but that women's role is special, and only women can accomplish this. And this idea, again, of Republican motherhood is right there. This painting does a great job of illustrating that. The other thing we see in the early 19th century is this cult of domesticity. And this is the idea that there's only one way to be the true woman. And basically, you're supposed to be pious, you're supposed to be pure, you're supposed to be domestic and submissive, that you're the angel of the house. Your job is to make your home a beautiful and comfortable place. You don't go outside, you don't go into society, you stay home. And remember, in this period, there's no restaurants. There's very few restaurants in the whole country. Streets are dirty. There's nothing to do outside. There's no public bathrooms. I mean, there's not a lot outside. So women were looking for, women would have been in their homes. So activities that related to women would have been home-based. That's part of the reason why Sarah Hale promoted the idea of Thanksgiving. It's the perfect holiday for women who are all about domesticity. I mean, it's everything. It's in the home, it's about family, and it's about a lot of food. So that's really what women were all about in that time. So women were considered to be frail and childlike and to need protection. Like, they could not sully their pure minds with things like politics, or money, or any of that. Women were above all of that. They were seen as angelic and above it and pure, and like they just should not be involved in anything in that external sphere. So this image, obviously not a picture from the time, just so we're clear on that. But this image really kind of illustrates the spheres of influence and the fact that even today you look at this and it's like, oh, that's not right. We just know, the woman is supposed to be washing, the man is supposed to be reading his magazine. That's how society was supposed to operate. So the cult of domesticity and this idea of spheres of influence kind of worked together. Women had the home and they were in charge in the house. They made all the decisions in the home. They decided how to decorate and who to invite for dinner and what we were going to eat and how the kids were raised. They were in charge of all those kind of things. And the man was in charge of earning the money and managing everything that happened outside the home, making those bigger decisions. So the idea of spheres of influence meant women shouldn't vote because that's not their role. Their role is to keep the house clean. And does it matter who the president is if your job is keeping the house clean? And by the way, keeping the house clean with staff generally, if you were at that level. So now that we've got a sense of the culture of the time and what women were kind of wrestling with, let's look at some of the anti-suffrage arguments. This is the dessert of the whole presentation. This is the good stuff. So there is a historian who I use for some of this because some of the putting a context on some of these reasons why women were opposed to suffrage requires conclusions to be made. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to blame it on the person who wrote the thing. I'm not going to take that for myself. So Janine Howard, she proposes that women were against the right to vote for three general reasons. The first is that they were concerned by the threat to families and the role of women, which was being impacted by a rapid social change, and that was scary for people. Now we know that in the 19th century things were changing quickly. I mean, they continue to change very quickly, but in this period we started to see industrialization. We saw people moving to cities. We saw family structures shifting. It was a lot of change and scary for people. So that was one thing, is trying to put a stop to that. Also, in this period, women tend to be much more aligned to their class than they were to their gender. They were upper class, they were lower class, they were middle class. That's how they organized themselves. They didn't really look at men versus women. That wasn't really how they saw the world. So getting the right to vote or being prevented from having the right to vote because of their gender wasn't such an issue. Also, they saw that they were powerful in their own sphere. Like in their sphere, they had a lot of autonomy and authority, and that worked for them. And many of them were fine with that. And they realized they're only powerful there, but that was enough. So The fact that goes with this, that we can definitely determine, is that the most anti-suffrage activity happened in the places with the highest levels of urbanization and immigration. So that fact fits with what she's saying. You know, some of this sounds uncomfortable. We don't like to think that, you know, it's about immigration or some of those other things, but the evidence seems to support her theory there. So here are some of the other arguments. That women would express emotionalism and incompetency in their duties, and therefore were not meant to be reformers. They argued that the states that had women's suffrage had lower pay for teachers. So they make less in the states where women can vote than they do in the states where women can't. So women are actually earning less in places where women can vote, which obviously says women shouldn't vote. Also, there were no child labor laws in the states where women could vote, and the divorce laws were lax. So clearly, there was a failure there. They also argued that states against women having the right to vote, typically women did not have the right to control their earnings or have equal custody of their children. But in states where women didn't vote, that was more likely to be the case. Finally, they accused the Mormons of trying to get the right to vote to reinforce the only form of Turkish harem in the country. So, you know, that polygamy was being promoted by women getting the right to vote. It was just going to be pervasive across the country. And then finally, and this is one you see a lot, that men are the ones with the brute strength, men are the ones going to war, so therefore men should be the ones deciding. They should be the voters. You know, and especially as we got closer to World War I, you saw that argument a lot more. If men are voting to go to war, then that's how it should be. Women do not have to worry about going to war in this period, so they shouldn't get a vote on it. Some other arguments. Voting requires a lot of time. It's a lot of work to figure out current, you know, it is and it isn't, but it requires so much time to understand current events and their origins and the implications. And I think, gosh, I wish everybody thought it took that much time. Also, women would now have to attend public or political events. They might be on juries. They would be expected to maybe run for office. And the women would have to be granted relief. If they were going to vote, they were going to take one more thing on. They needed something off their plates. It was too much with them having domestic obligations, church chores, social commitments. They were so overburdened already that unless you take one of those off their plate, they couldn't possibly add voting to the list. And because all of those were their sphere, those were all kind of their jobs, they couldn't possibly take on voting. Some other arguments. They argue that God and nature said that men and women are separate and they have different skills and abilities. They argued that the imposition of the ballot, and they use that phrase, is burdensome and disruptive or destructive. The burden of the ballot is destructive. Also, they were concerned about poor women voting. The poor and the vicious vote would double. So now you would have double the number of immigrants who would be out there voting. Low class, low morality, people like that. Women would be corrupted by the ballot. There was this idea that women had, they had their own ability to persuade because they weren't voters, that they could go and talk to politicians and make requests because they were not in the position of being voters one way or another. And there was this idea that they would be corrupted just as men had been corrupted by politics. There was an idea that the family represents, that they make their decision as a family, and if a man and a woman are both voting, the woman's just going to vote for who the man says to vote anyway. I know that happens in all of our houses, doesn't it? So, you know, the man is going to tell the woman and then she'll just vote. So what's the difference? We're just doubling the number of votes, but it's not changing anything. They thought that women might lose their special protections. You know, women don't go into battle, some of those other things, if they were to vote. And a lot of women didn't want to vote. And this is important because a lot of women didn't want to vote. There was a time where some claim that maybe as many as 9 out of 10 women didn't want the right to vote. Women had to be convinced that it was a good idea. It wasn't something that every woman woke up and said, I need the right to vote. It was a thing that grew over time, but until it did, a lot of women just didn't see the need for it. And suffragists were tied to all sorts of scary social movements, things like socialism. And they were changing the social order, which was threatening to people. So of course, any good woman would probably want to step back from that because you wouldn't want to be associated with those kind of things. So there's some definite ironies to the anti-movement, trying to fight against women getting the right to vote. The first irony is that these women who wanted nothing to do with politics had to be involved in politics in order to prevent women getting the right to vote. So ironically enough, they had to actually step in the pool they didn't want anybody getting into in order to try to meet their goals. They had to commit to political parties as well in order to get that support to try to prevent women from voting. They also had to adopt tactics that they didn't want to use. They had to do public speaking and lobbying and fundraising. And public speaking, by the way, if you were a lady, that was unheard of. When Harriet Beecher Stowe was, when she was selling thousands of books as the second most popular author next to the Bible, when she was selling all these books, she would go to lectures, but she wouldn't speak. Her husband would get up and talk for her, and she would sit in the audience because that wasn't considered ladylike for her to get up and talk. So for these women who were the bastions of protecting women's separateness and their femininity, having to get up and talk was horrifying, but they had to do it in order to get their goal accomplished. Finally, they had to get the anti-referenda on ballots. Like, you had to vote on it. Well, and think about how ironic that is. Women were allowed to vote on whether women should be allowed to vote. And women who didn't want women to get the right to vote had to promote the idea that that had to go on a ballot. So it's very strange sort of logic, but it's what happened. And many of those women, what they said is, you know, here's what we're going to do. We'll put it on the ballot, but then no women should vote for it. Because if women just don't vote, it proves their point that women don't vote, that women don't want to vote. So they were willing to put it on the ballot, but then again, the goal was that women would just refuse to vote at all. That was kind of how they got around that. But those ironies were definitely out there, and it kind of fascinate me because, you know, they had to do the thing they didn't want to do to try to stop people from doing the thing they didn't want to do. So before 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, you see all of these states had passed some form of women's suffrage. So by 1920, it was almost inevitable, and eventually Woodrow Wilson pretty much had to sign on for women getting the right to vote for a couple different reasons, including he and many other politicians realized it's happening. And if they were the party that continued to oppose it, when women got the right to vote, what was going to happen to them? They were all going to lose their jobs. So eventually they realized that they had to promote women's suffrage. So this is the last picture I have for you. I love this one because this is the headquarters of the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And who do you see outside there? It's just men. So even at their headquarters, again, the women would not have wanted to make themselves very known. So that is the story of the women who are against women getting the right to vote. I can now take your questions. Yes? Can you, I only heard part of that. Yes, yeah. So the question was, can you draw a connection between women's class and their interest in voting? And it's a little tricky. So if you were very poor, you wouldn't have cared about the right to vote because you would have been worried about feeding your family. Like literally, you know, voting or starving to death, it's going to be starving to death. But for very wealthy women, they had all the power they needed. They didn't really need to vote to have their words heard. You know, they had, in many cases, they had husbands who were very involved in politics that they could lobby, you know, kind of on the side. And they were in circles where they had that kind of power. So they didn't need the right to vote. So it was those women in the middle who were most likely to kind of push for that. So excellent question. Anybody else? Paul, are there no questions? Okay. Anybody else with a question? Yes.
So what was different between the states that allowed voting and the states that didn't? What do you think has happened? Were some factors that influenced this voting, or this, you know, allowing it to happen?
I think the biggest reason why the early adopters did so is they were Western states, so they were far less entrenched in tradition. You know, you were non-traditional if you moved to a Western state to begin with. In some cases, they needed to have a certain population to become a state, and it's based on the population of voters. So if we let women vote, then we have more people, then we can become a state a little more quickly. Also, women were asked to do more in those states, and were given a lot more freedom to do things that they wouldn't have been allowed to do in the East. So it made more sense, and they're like the powerful women we just talked about in the East, they didn't go to the West. The ones that were most opposed to women getting the right to vote did not travel to the West. So because of that, it was much easier to pass an amendment in a state like Colorado or Wyoming to get the right to vote versus the Eastern states were definitely the last to get the right to vote. The Eastern states and the Southern states, because they had much more entrenched social structures. So good question. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that interesting. We're doing one of these every single month up through June with the exception of December. So we'd love to see you here for the next one. Hopefully in a couple months, we won't all be wearing masks, but maybe we will. So again, thank you for your time and attention. I sincerely appreciate it. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.